Hello, my friends. So today I'd like to just read to you an interesting article from the Harvard Theological Review, published in October 1927, Volume 20, Number 4. The title of it is Foreign Groups in Rome During the First Centuries of the Empire, by George LaPiana. And the particular section that I'll be reading is Section 5, Nationalism and Universalism in the Mystery Religions in Rome, Foreign Religions and State Religion, the Process of Romanization and the Failure of the Cults. And a few interesting things that I thought about when I was reading this was the inherent difference in nationalistic versus universalistic conceptions of religion, and how those differing conceptions lead to differing views of the state. One really interesting thing about universalist conceptions of religion is that they always seem to incentivize the mixing of races and nations and the unification of all nations within an empire, and how this universalistic conception of religion was fostered and allowed to thrive within the Roman Empire because the way that these religions work inherently bolster and support a political regime like the Roman Empire that seeks to unify many different nations and many different cultures that are consisting in many different races and ethnicities, and how that sort of religious conception will always come with a political agenda or a political institution. And I think that this sort of thing is worthwhile to study because not only is there a continuity going back to this period, the religions right now that are most widely practiced derive directly and have a direct continuity going back to this period, not only in doctrine, in spiritual doctrine, but I think also in the genealogy of the ruling class politically right now. There has been a continuity in blood, not only in doctrine. And it's interesting because in a couple sections of this article, the author mentions how the priestly class of these universalist religions, even after these religions as a whole became open to other races, and many different people from different races and different nations began joining these religions, and the universalist nature of these religions was canonized, basically, was made official within the religion. It was opened up to anyone to join. Even once that happened, the high priestly class of those religions remained exclusive to the nations from which they originated. So, in order for these doctrines to continue, in order for the ideas, the whole religious doctrine, in order for that to continue, it was preserved by people of a certain race, of a certain blood relation, and probably of particular families. So I think that's an interesting thing, and just think about those sorts of things as I'm reading this. So, and I'll put a link to this in the comment. It's on JSTOR, JSTOR. You can get a copy if you're a university student, or you could just make an account and download it. I think you get like 6 free downloads per month or something like that, so it doesn't cost you anything. But anyway, the foreign religions in Rome, though various in origin and introduced at different times and in part under diverse circumstances, all had, in their relation to their new environment, a development in some degree parallel, which finally brought them into converging lines and to a common ground. As we have seen, most of these religions were introduced by immigrants, yet there is a remarkable difference between the process which, in republican times and during the early empire, brought to Rome the religions of Asia Minor and Egypt, the cults of the Syrian gods, and even the African cults, and that which, in the 3rd century, gave success in Rome to the solar religion and the Persian mysteries. While in the former group of religions, immigrants played the most important and a decisive part in both the earlier and the final stage of their history. In the latter cults, the immigrants were only an incidental and secondary element. This difference in the external history of these foreign religions in Rome came about because the former were introduced as national religions of foreign groups, and remained such, at least in certain aspects of their religious practices and organization, while the solar religion, when it was officially introduced in Rome, appeared in the character of a cosmopolitan religion. Not all, however, it must be observed, of the religions of the immigrants were originally in the same sense national religions. The gods and goddesses of cities and regions brought to Rome by their devotees were protector deities of a local character, and the official worship of which they received in their cities of origin was for the immigrants the symbol of their national cohesion and the continuity of the religious traditions of their ancestors. But the mystery cults, with their eschatological and soteriological content, were originally not official cults of cities and states. In origin, mostly agrarian, their home development had been on the margin of, and sometimes in conflict with, the official public cults. Yet an interpenetration and partial fusion of these two types of religion had already taken place in the eastern countries before the introduction of the mysteries in Rome. The great Phrygian mother had become a partner in the mysteries of Attis. The gods of Egypt had assumed a role in the mysteries of Osiris, and the ancient gods of Persia in the mysteries of Mithra. This contamination of the agrarian religions and their myths of vegetation and fertility with the city religions and their myths of the city gods who, whatever their remote origin, had assumed a civic meaning and the value of political and national symbols, coincided in those countries with the loss of independence or their national dynasties through political and military decay. The empire of Alexander and the Hellenistic kingdoms and states established on its ruins not only made possible an amalgamation of civilizations of various origin, but by giving a great impulse to the process of urbanization, by the establishing in many lands new Greek cities on the site of native villages and new town centers for large agricultural districts, they offered the old agrarian cults and rites the opportunity to assume under new Hellenistic forms the character of city and national religions. Just as an aside from me, this part is really interesting in that the process of urbanization always seems to follow the progress or the process of imperial conquest. That the world order can only establish itself through a centralization of power within the urban zone and a centralization of the economy, a control over the economy through urbanization. Because once you replace many small independent farmers, family farmers, with large agricultural districts that are on plots of land that are controlled by a ruling dynasty, that is the best way to gain control over a population. And once you do that, once you replace the spread out family farms with large-scale agricultural industries that are on the lands that are controlled by small groups of people, very close and compact, but massive infrastructure projects that come along with those sorts of things. That is the best way to gain control over a population. So these things go hand in hand. Anyway, back to the article. The political unification of all those countries under Roman rule and the process of urbanization, carried on more thoroughly by the emperors of the first 2 centuries, opened a still wider field of activity to the mystery religions. And at the same time, the great migratory movements of the populations of the empire from one province to another, which succeeded the earlier Hellenistic diaspora, made it not only possible but even inevitable for these religions to develop further the universalistic tendencies inherent in their character as religions of individual salvation, and breaking over their restriction to one race or state, to become open to all believers who might seek to be saved through initiation. Another quick aside. Beware the people today, online in pagan circles, who claim that they will somehow save your soul through some kind of initiatory ritual or some kind of, repeating rituals, getting together and doing some kind of strange ritual type behavior to save your soul. That's a little shady, in my opinion. But back to the article. Thus, the mystery cults, introduced into Rome by foreigners and largely practiced by them, were not slow to claim universality and to open their ranks to applicants from the various groups of the cosmopolitan population of the city. But, as we have seen, these religions did not entirely lose their national character and connections, even when they put forward more outspokenly the claim to universality. And when the philosophical and theological syncretism of their new religious environment attempted a mutual interpenetration of their various myths and symbols. The mystery cults in Rome lived and developed under the constant strain of this interior conflict between 2 opposite tendencies, that of keeping their national or racial character, and that of becoming really and truly universal religions. The former tendency was the result of many causes, but above all it was due to the conservative force of tradition and to the practical necessity of preserving ritual continuity. So think of that. I just want to read that again. He's saying the former tendency, that of retaining their national and racial character, and I would say even familial when it comes to the high upper priests, the upper class of priests. The former tendency was the result of many causes, but above all it was due to the conservative force of tradition and to the practical necessity of preserving ritual continuity. And it was fostered by the interests of the priestly classes in whose hands lay the spiritual control of the cults. To the immigrants from Eastern regions, and especially to those of the servile classes, the ancient official gods of the cities and states of their land of origin could not appear in the same guise of civic deities as to their fathers, and to a certain extent to their countrymen who still lived in the old country. Since the disappearance of the political states or city-states, now absorbed into the great Roman Empire, had deprived those deities of their main function of protecting and safeguarding the national, political, and social organization. They would have lost their very reason for existence if a new function had not been given to them. Some of them were attracted within the orbit of the mystery cults, in which they played a new role in the myths of salvation. Others, as it was in the case with the Syrian gods, although they maintained their original distinctive local titles, yet assumed a new meaning, became symbols of and personifications of universal powers, and were the vehicles through which the solar religion reached the West. The national traditions of the immigrants came thus to be represented by the mystery cults and by the rejuvenated deities in the larger setting of universalistic religions. No less strong were the reasons connected with the liturgical practices that kept those religions bound to their past history and their native traditions. Since salvation was dependent upon the exact performance of the rituals which induced the saving experience, it was a matter of great importance to safeguard the unbroken continuity of liturgical tradition. It is true that all these mysteries had undergone remarkable modification in their later Hellenistic environment, assuming Greek forms and adopting, at least in part, the Greek language. But nevertheless, the essential and distinguishing liturgical ceremonies, especially those of the secret initiation, remained unchanged, and the use of magic formulae in the ancient languages was always a conspicuous part of the esoteric ritual. The use of magic formulae in the ancient languages was always a conspicuous part of the esoteric ritual. Furthermore, the various racial origins of the mysteries were even more prominent in the myths which explained and justified the ritual, in the theological elaborations which represented the age-old wisdom of the ancient Eastern civilizations. A native priesthood offered the best guarantee for the continuity of the ritual and doctrinal tradition. It is therefore not surprising that in Rome, even after these cults obtained recognition and protection and made converts from all the races, the priesthood remained in the hands of foreigners or of Roman citizens of foreign extraction. On the other hand, compelling motives urged those religions not only to abandon their national exclusiveness, which, after all, had been given up in their Hellenistic environment, but to claim a universal character. Cosmopolitan Rome, ever growing more mixed in race, could be conquered only by emphasizing the universalistic content of these religions of individual salvation, and by reinterpreting their national myths and their rites and religious experience in the light of a syncretistic mythology and theology. The favor of the political power and more or less official position that these cults obtained in Roman religious life made the more necessary their complete denationalization. But the strongest influence came from the tendency to religious syncretism prepared and advocated by philosophers and thinkers, like the Platonists, Neoplatonists. This was gradually gaining ground in Rome and the Empire, and finally, when Roman institutions seemed on the verge of ruin, and in the process of readjustment, religious unification presented a hopeful means of strengthening the political structure of the empire, was adopted as a political program by the state. It is commonly thought that the various religions of Rome, with the exception of Christianity, lent themselves not only willingly, but even with enthusiasm, to the process of absorption into a universal religious syncretism, which was finally represented by the cult of the Sol Invictus as the sum total of all divine powers and all divine manifestations, the supreme synthesis of the eternal laws on which the destiny of man in this world and the next depends, and the source from which all particular religious experiences derive their value and significance. But it seems to me that the attitude taken by the religions to this comprehensive syncretism, which reached its climax in the 3rd century, was not so unselfish. The general notion that each people was bound to have its own religion as an essential requisite of its national existence and a treasured national possession was slow to die. It implied the notion of a national ownership of the powerful protection of ancestral deities and of an exclusive right to the advantages and privileges derived from the worship of them. National pride and family traditions could not easily give up all of this. When historical events and political and social vicissitudes brought together the Mediterranean races and religio-national exclusivism could not be maintained in practice, and when these religions began to open their ranks to individuals of all races, the national notion survived in various forms. The most typical of these is to be seen in the Eleusinian Mysteries, in which the foreigners who were initiated were supposed by virtue of the initiation to become members of the Hellenic nation. This notion of religio-national adoption was an intermediary stage in the process of the universalization of religions. And not only in the mystery religions, but the state and city official religions present a similar historical development. On the one hand, they remained attached to their national exclusivism, or at least to their national religious privileges. On the other, they had recourse to the juridical fiction of adoption, either of foreign deities into the circle of Dei Patri, or of the foreign races into the ranks of worshippers of the national god. The former was the method followed by Rome, the latter that of Judaism, in which, however, the adoption of Gentiles as members of the Jewish nation was the last stage in the evolution toward universalism, the whole tradition of the special privileges of the Jewish race being left intact. In all other religions, the process of denationalization had to advance further in the attempt to reach true universalism. It was necessary to cast out not only all national limitations, but also all national and racial connotation. Only so they could achieve an ethnic universalism. But such a universalism, though so difficult to achieve, would not have made a religion truly universal. The conception of universalism implied something more. The universalism of the Roman Empire was not due to the mere fact that Rome had brought together under her supremacy all the Mediterranean races, but primarily to the fact that, above all diversity of races and traditions, she had established a system of centralized political and administrative control, an administrative organization, and a system of law which secured unity and was the practical manifestation of the fundamental conception of the nature of the state peculiar to Roman juridical wisdom. Parallel with that, in a religion, the conception of universalism implied more than the opening of its ranks and its worship to all races. Religious universalism implies the possession of a religious moral content of universal value, and of a religious organization which could make it possible for such a religion to interpenetrate and influence all the activities of individual and associated life, to formulate standards and programs for social and political conduct, and to extend its teaching and practices over all the realities of this life, as well as over the hopes of the life to come. Such was the task with which these religions were confronted, and the irresistible current which dragged them towards syncretism seemed to offer the best opportunity. But, in spite of it, the mystery religions failed to reach that goal. Undoubtedly, they desired to adopt each for itself all the elements of traditional mythologies and mystical experiences by which immortality and salvation could be secured, but they were no less anxious not to be absorbed by other cults, so to lose their individuality, and indeed their reason for a separate existence. In other words, they all welcomed a religious unification, provided it came to pass on their own ground. The more so that long before religious syncretism became a political measure, these religions had put forward the claim to be a supreme synthesis of all religious values, and so had reinterpreted their myths in competition with one another. The influence of the eclectic universalism, which aimed at a combination of the religious traditions and thought of the Oriental, Greek, and Roman world, was made to serve their individual interests. The fluctuating character of their myths, the similarity of their mystical experience, and the common orgiastic element in their liturgies facilitated the assimilation, and even the identification of religions of this type. But their national and racial traditions, of their peculiar ritual practices, and the interests of their priestly classes proved strong enough to assure their individual existence as separate religions, even when the process of identification obliterated all difference in their spiritual content, at least in the eyes of thinkers and in the consciousness of the educated classes, including the priesthood itself. So just another aside here, he's saying the priesthood itself, the educated elite in all of these religions, even though on the surface these religions seem to be competing with each other, trying to out-recruit each other, trying to, say that the others are wrong and we're right. At the very top, he's saying the highest educated classes knew that all of these religions were just one and the same. Fundamentally, the essence of these religions is basically the same, even though they were taking on different characters in each of the regions that they existed in order to better appeal to those local populations. So think of that as a political strategy. Think of that as being strategically acted out, because I don't think that this is an accident. If the priestly class understood that these were all fundamentally and essentially the same, then it's really just a bunch of different arms coming out of the same body.